Welcome to the Economic and Political History Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas on the intersection of economics, political science, and history. Everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Economic and Political History Podcast. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Today I had the great pleasure of speaking with Jo Quinn. Jo is professor of ancient history at Oxford University, and she is the author of How the World Made the West a 4,000-Year History, a book that was recently published by Random House. And I had a fascinating conversation with her. We talk about ancient history, about the idea of civilization. We also talk about history as an academic field. It was a very stimulating and entertaining conversation. We didn't record the video, so unfortunately for those of you watching this on YouTube, you wouldn't enjoy that part. But again, the conversation was very fun, very fun. So I encourage you to stay connected and listen to it. Without any further to say, please listen to Jo. Before getting into the book, I would like to ask you about your career. And I saw, and by the way, I want to congratulate you for this. You're going to be the first woman to hold a chair in ancient history at Cambridge, right?
Yes, thank you.
Again, congratulations. But how do you get there? What's the story? How does someone ended up holding this prestigious position?
Well, I think I got there by quite a non-traditional route, at least in Oxbridge terms. I went to a state school in the UK, which still isn't very normal for people who make a career out of being an academic classicist. And we didn't really have a lot of teachers, so I taught myself Latin. I loved languages, so Latin was just a kind of another language that I was learning. And then I when I was choosing what to do at university, I wanted to do something, I think teenagers always want to be different and weird and rebellious in some way. And so for me, doing something like classics was really a kind of rebellion against my kind of very kind of normal upbringing. And so I did that at Oxford. And as I say, I came into it really through the languages and through loving languages and loving the kind of logic of learning languages. But once I got to Oxford, I had started taking courses in ancient history, and realised that was, going to become even more of a passion. That just finding out why, or trying to work out why things have happened the way they have, just turned into a kind of lifelong quest, really. And then I was lucky enough to come to California as a graduate student, and I studied at Berkeley, partly at Stanford as well, but mostly at Berkeley, for my master's and doctorate. And then I went to Rome on a postdoc, which was really wonderful, and I got to reconnect with my love of languages again. And I kind of thought I might just stay there forever, but then I kind of realised that you actually do need a job in order to be able to afford rent and so on. So I was very lucky. A job came up at Oxford during my postdoc, and I was there for this. This would be my 21st year now, and in January I moved to Cambridge.
Tell me about your decision to come to California. I mean, you were, I think by then you were already interested in the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
Why do you think that living and moving so far away from the Mediterranean was a good idea?
It's a good question. I think I really wanted to go to an American graduate program, because the thing about studying in Britain, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing or a good thing, it's just a different thing, is that basically you get more and more specialised as you go on. So even at school, the last 2 years at school, kids only do 3 subjects in Britain. And then it gets sort of smaller and smaller as you get to university. You apply to university to do a specific course in a specific subject. After that, you'll often, just do one very specific topic for a doctoral thesis. And I knew that if I came to America, I would be able to do a much broader course. I'd be able to learn a lot more. And when I started kind of asking people, asking my professors at Oxford, asking other people where would be a good place to go, to apply to try to go, basically everyone immediately said Berkeley to me, that was just such an extraordinary program. The program in Ancient History and Mediterranean Archaeology there, the group in Ancient History and Mediterranean Archaeology was and still is really kind of an extraordinary and very famous program for studying the ancient world in a broader way than just Greece and Rome. And that was already something I was really interested in, but I hadn't been equipped as an undergraduate at Oxford to do that, because it was a very Greco-Roman focused program. So I knew I'd be able to learn new languages, new ancient languages and modern languages. And I knew that I'd be able to take a broader range of courses. And in the end, that turned out to be really true. So I took courses in 20th century Italian history, and history of Italian imperialism. I took courses in post-colonial French literature. I took courses that seemed so far away from the ancient Mediterranean, but actually were really fundamental, more fundamental in a lot of ways for the career I've had since, because they're things I couldn't have done on my own. I already knew how to read an academic article in my field. I knew how to research a new topic in ancient history. But these gave me a whole different set of ideas and tools and so on. So I'll always be incredibly grateful to Berkeley for that. Yeah.
And it makes a lot of sense now that you mentioned that, because your book, if anything, is characterized by that, right? The broad scope of knowledge that it describes. So it makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to ask you more about this maybe later regarding the evolution of your career, that it's again broader than just the one of a plain ancient historian, I guess. But to get into the book, you have this sort of foundational concept that you label civilizational thinking, right? Why don't you tell us about that? What's that concept, which in a certain way reacts to the idea of civilizations? And then I'm going to ask you what's the problem with civilizations, and if there's a problem with it, what options do we have for calling those things that we have been calling civilizations so far?
Yeah. Well, I think when I started work on this book, it came out of an impulse as somebody who teaches an awful lot of Greco-Roman history, who spends a lot of time reading Greek and Latin authors, that the idea that I kept coming across, that Western civilization was sort of found its roots in Greece and Rome, was really kind of shortchanging the world that I study and teach, not just the sort of broader Mediterranean, broader ancient world, but even the Greeks and Romans, because, that's absolutely not what those authors say. They're very aware that some Greek speakers, Latin speakers, and so on, the Roman Empire itself has kind of roots and inspiration and models kind of all over the known world. So it started off from that kind of desire to kind of stand up for, in a way, the Greek and Roman tradition against this modern habit of misrepresenting it. But as I started to really think about the book, research it, kind of look at how that modern idea had come about, I realized that there was a bigger problem in a way, and that was this thing that I call civilizational thinking. Because civilizations seem like such a natural way to talk about the world, especially a really natural way to talk about history. Mesopotamian civilization or Egyptian civilization or Greek civilization, whatever it might be, European civilization, Western civilization. But it's actually a very modern idea. The idea of civilization at all, the noun civilization, is a product of the 1750s. And you don't get the plural, civilizations, this idea of discrete, separate cultures, until the 1820s. And I mean, these are just the first time these words are used. It takes a long time, in both cases, for them even to catch on. So I kind of became aware that this idea, the whole idea of civilization, and in particular civilizations in the plural, was really a modern creation. And that doesn't in itself, of course, mean that it's wrong, or bad, but that it came alongside a lot of other very modern ideas about the world, ideas about history as constant progress in the 18th century, for instance, or in the 19th century, the idea of races as a way of kind of organizing humans biologically. And I came to see that this separate civilizations was a way of organizing humans culturally in a very similar way. And the chronology of those two concepts kind of catching on in European thought, is very similar. So that's essentially what the book became about for me, that the history of what we now call the West became a case study for the problems of civilizational thinking and the way that I think it has misled us over the last couple of centuries.
That's fascinating. And let me then ask you precisely about that, about then how should we think about the West? What does the West mean then if you move away from that civilizational approach?
Right. I think if you move away from the civilizational approach and think about history instead in terms of actions, connections, meeting, journeys, relationships, so not sort of static entities, in particular cultures or civilizations, but actions and interactions, then you get a very different sort of history of the West, and essentially the kind of history I've tried to write in this book, which is a history of entanglement and exchange, and I mean, not always in a positive way. There's a lot of war in the book, and war is a very efficient way to exchange information. Yeah. So I don't want to be Pollyannish about this. It's certainly not all a happy story, but I think there is a story that leads up to the world that we now call the West, that I think you can trace from, say, about 1500 CE onwards. That's when you begin to get the kinds of, when sort of a map of Europe begins to look something kind of that we would find familiar now. In particular, the nations of the far west of Europe begin to really kind of coalesce into the sort of entities that then are kind of driving the 18th and 19th century ideas of civilizational thinking. The idea of the book is to tell the story leading up to that point over 4,000 years. I mean, it could have gone back further. It could have been 400,000 probably, but that would have taken even longer, and it took long enough. So I thought that tracing it from the Bronze Age to the Age of Exploration would kind of I'd be able to tell the story in a meaningful way.
How did you manage with that? How did you decide what to include and what not to include in this 4,000-year history?
That was really tough, and I had to do a lot of thinking about it as I went along. It is not one of those books where I had a structure from the beginning and it stayed the same. I was constantly, rewriting the book, of course, but also rewriting the whole pattern of the book. But in the end, so the chronology of it was fairly clear, certainly at the end. So I always knew I wanted to finish around 1500, partly because, as I say, that's when I think you begin to see something that looks familiar, that looks like what we now think of as the West in Europe. And you're beginning to see the kind of formation of the sort of settler colonies overseas that make up kind of the modern West. But also because that moment, I think, is when you start to see real cultural divisions being imposed on the world for the first time. Things like the expulsion of the Jews and the Muslims from Europe, that kind of thing. Rhetorical representations of the Ottoman Empire on the one hand, a different but equally negative rhetoric about indigenous Americans on the other hand. And you just kind of begin to see a kind of at the same time as many historians would quite rightly point to the whole globe coming together around 1500 for the first time, really. I wanted to kind of point out there's other story going on at the same time, which is about real cultural fissures opening up, ideological fissures opening up for the first time at the same time as that. So the end was clear. The beginning took a lot longer to work out, whether it was going to be 3,000 years altogether, 3,500, 4,000. That's at some point I considered 20,000 or 40,000, or maybe going back to the end of the Ice Age. But in the end, I decided that what I wanted to begin with was the beginning of sailing on the sea. That seemed the most important moment for bringing Europe, particularly Western Europe, but really Europe as a whole, into a bigger story of world history. Because before you have sailing, you can communicate, of course, and Europe wasn't cut off entirely before that moment. But the only way of really reaching places that are across a kind of wide body of water, in most cases, is by canoe, and that takes a long time. And more importantly, you can't carry much with you in a canoe. Because there's not a lot of space. Once you've got the canoers themselves, the rowers there, if you like, and you've got the water they're going to need for a long journey. It's not the journeys themselves are technically that hard. I mean, these sorts of journeys were going on for thousands more years in the North Sea in particular, very long distance, very difficult, cold, stormy journeys by kind of long canoe type boats. But you just can't take an awful lot with you once you've got the people and the water they're going to need. So once the technology of sailing develops, which happens on the Nile around 3000 BCE, sort of in the area of what we now call Sudan, and then over the next kind of few hundred years, finally reaches the Mediterranean via Egyptian sailors. Once you've got that in the Mediterranean, you can go so much further, so much faster, and crucially, you can take a lot more with you. So I think that's why there's a sort of moment in the third millennium, towards the end of the third millennium BCE, where Europe is kind of reconnected for the last time. That once you've got sailing boats reaching places like Crete and then the Aegean and then gradually further west, the whole story takes another 1,000 years to even get to the Atlantic. But it's the start of a story that never ends again. Europe's never cut off again at that point. So that's the kind of chronology in the end that I settled on. And this other question of what to include and what not to include, that is really tough, was very tough indeed, particularly when I got to the medieval period, which has a distressing number of sources, really a lot of evidence. And I realized how privileged I am in my speciality as an ancient historian. We just have a lot less evidence, and that really makes life much easier. But what I decided to do quite early on, and this I think worked for me at least, was that, I would think I have to tell this story from my own positionality in the far west of Europe as, an Irish woman living in Britain, working in a British university. So, for most of human history, it's be considered the absolute barbarian back of beyond. And I've got to kind of just sort of see what can I see? What's actually going to affect me? And what's really important for the story I'm trying to tell about the importance of contact in driving innovation and change in history. And, if something hit one of those criteria, or ideally both of them, then that was a story that I wanted to tell.
Okay, it's very interesting. Like, there's this experience of reading the book, and it's a whole different experience to notice how the book was created. So I love that. And now I want to ask you about the early part of the story, right? So you have sailing, then you have the Minoans, and frequently the way in which people talk about the Minoans, and I this myself. I have this class here, and it's called Societal Collapse. It's not. I dare to talk about ancient history a bit when we start talking about the late Bronze Age collapse. It's a loaded term, I know. But anyway, so I talk about the Minoans briefly, and I see myself describing them as the first civilization in Europe or something like that. And I remember thinking, like, what am I saying this? Well, I guess it is. I don't know. And then, but like how it feels is they seem to be this outcome of this interaction with the East, right? So I guess what I would like to ask you is about how do you interpret this European element of the Minoans, how influenced they were by these other peoples in the East, and how crucial they actually were for the development of the rest of the cultures in mainland Greece and so forth.
So I think that, it's a great example, the Minoans, when you're thinking about civilizational thinking, because it's a completely made up culture, very modern culture. That idea of the Minoans as the first European civilization. It's no wonder that I think, it's a sort of natural impulse to talk about it that way, because that's the way the most famous excavators of Crete, which is where this Minoan civilization is supposed to have taken place, if you like, and taken hold. That's the way they talked about it. Back at the basically beginning of the 20th century, when excavations on Crete started to expose this really extraordinary set of kind of, on the one hand, the most impressively, there's these very large buildings that are still often called palaces, though we don't really know what they were. But then also these very large towns around them, much bigger than anything else in the mainland Europe, certainly, at that time. Although there are the question of what counts as a kind of urban site is a very interesting one. But these ones, that look kind of like Greek and Roman sort of classical cities, if you like. These are the earliest ones, and they're surprisingly big and impressive. So, Crete's always attracted a lot of attention for that. But this idea of Minoan civilization, it's almost, it kind of comes out of an academic dispute, essentially. It's a very kind of almost a sort of scholarly whim. So there are people at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, there are European archaeologists digging in mainland Greece, and there are European archaeologists digging on Crete. And they both think, of course, that what they're discovering is the most important thing and it's a civilization, whereas what the other guys are discovering, and they're not all guys, especially on Crete, but what the other archaeologists are discovering is some kind of lesser thing, not as important, not as interesting. So the way that works is that people who are digging in Greece, this includes people like Heinrich Schliemann, digging at Mycenae and places like that, when they find out about these kind of even older, bigger sites on Crete, the general line is, well, we've got this Mycenaean civilization. So this thing on Crete must be just some sort of primitive predecessor. It's like the kind of, early first go at this, but then the kind of real flourishing of it is this Mycenaean civilization. Whereas, of course, the Cretan archaeologists see it differently. And their view is, our Cretan Minoan civilization, named after this kind of legendary king of Crete, Minos, this Minoan civilization, that's the important thing. That's the first civilization in Europe, says Arthur Evans, the great excavator of Knossos on Crete. And this thing that they're digging up, these places they're digging up in Greece, that's just some sort of decadent afterthought. That's like late Minoan. So the people who are championing the idea of Mycenaean civilization see what's happening on Crete as kind of early Mycenaean, whereas the people who are digging on Crete see what's happening in the mainland as late Minoan. And it's only, when all this first generation have died, that their students start fighting. And then the kind of resolution is, okay, we can have two civilizations and they're just going to be different. And so that's really where the idea of Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations comes from. It's almost the sort of an agreement to disagree or something among scholars. So that's kind of why, for me, that's actually a really kind of lovely example of civilizational thinking, because it's not just that these are two kind of civilizations that are absolutely invented essentially in the 20th century, very late 19th, 20th century, but also that they're kind of invented by mistake, really, the idea of two of them. So that's one thing. The question of what's actually going on Crete is just so interesting for my story, because Crete is the first place that sailing boats reach from the Levant, essentially. So places in modern day Lebanon are the big ports then. So places like Byblos is the biggest, Tyre, Sidon. These are places that have great connections with Egypt, from people sailing around the kind of edge of the Mediterranean, if you like, coastal sailing. So we're already kind of quite a way into the story here. You've got sailing developing on the Upper Nile, coming along the river, reaching the Mediterranean. People then work out how to sail kind of around the edge of the sea in a coastal way. And then it takes, another several hundred years for sailors in the Levant, it's like ports like Byblos, to work out how to sail west, because the winds in the Mediterranean are largely westerly. So it's actually very difficult to sail from east to west, much easier to sail in the other direction, but there weren't sailing boats to start. You couldn't start from there. So they were starting from the eastern Mediterranean, and it was a real technical challenge to work out how to sail west. Once you can do that, basically the first place you get to is going to be Crete. And the reason that is good if you're in search of metals, which is the kind of thing that, it's sort of like oil in the modern world, basically. Like, there are some things that make very complicated, expensive, difficult, long-term investments worth it. And in antiquity, that's metal. And in this case, it's getting to the metals of the Aegean, the metals of Anatolia, and so on. That's what's driving a lot of the very early, well, not even very early, driving a lot of the Bronze Age sailing traffic in the Mediterranean, sort of developments in sailing. And so Crete is a good place to get to, because they can technically reach it. And it's not that Crete itself has many metals, but Crete is a good place to exchange metals, because Crete already has long time connections with what's now the Greek mainland, with other islands in the Aegean and so on. People have been rowing and kind of canoeing around there for a long time. So Crete is a good kind of place to catch the market in metals, and various other fun things, but metals are the main thing. And what's very striking is that, there's a whole amazing story of the development of Crete in itself, that goes back, a long time earlier than the arrival of foreign sailing ships on the horizon, which probably wasn't all that welcome in a lot of ways. But you see these extraordinary changes on the island that are coincident with the arrival of the sailing boats. Now, of course, archaeologically, you can't prove causation. It could all be a complete coincidence. But that's when you start to get the kind of sophisticated bronze working on the island. You start to get the wheel, you get the donkey, and you get writing for the first time. You also get a huge increase in the size of these towns on the island. You get a big increase in the kind of size and sort of, in a sense, complexity. I won't say sophistication, because that's we take an idea out of their own heads, I think. But we don't know how they saw it. But certainly increasing complexity in building there. So a whole lot of new stuff is going on for the first time. This is around 2000 BCE. Real change on Crete. And it's not all about foreign models or foreign influence or whatever. And that's a really important thing to say. Not least because I think a bunch of Cretan archaeologists would be annoyed if I didn't. But it seems extremely unlikely that it's not at least partly about that.
Fair,
yeah. But I mean, one of the things I think is most interesting is that a lot of the changes, sort of like influence is a kind of problematic concept in my view, because it sort of puts the agency with the earlier people or activity, whatever. It's actually the later people who are taking a model and doing something with it. And Crete's a kind of a nice example of that, because writing appears on the island around about 2000 BCE. There's writing in scripts like Linear A, Cretan hieroglyphic. These are still undeciphered. The language they're writing down is unknown. It does not appear to be Indo-European. Whatever language or languages possibly were being spoken on the island of Crete at that time, they have not any connections with other contemporary languages, or even later ones have yet to be identified. And the writing system as well is completely different from anything that's going on at the same time. So you've got Egyptian hieroglyphics by this point. You've got cuneiform in Mesopotamia. And the kinds of sailors who are arriving on Crete from ports like Byblos in the Levant, even possibly people coming from Egypt and so on, those are going to be the writing systems that they're familiar with. But what happens, what kind of develops on Crete has nothing to do with any of those writing systems. It's very peculiar to the island. It's peculiar in other ways as well, but it's peculiar to the island. And what I love about that is that it means that what people are doing is not that they're just accepting some, cultural export from elsewhere. It's that they're hearing about something. They've got this idea, okay, you can write a language down and that can be useful, particularly if you've got greater complexity in your society and so on. This may be the moment to kind of try and do this. But it doesn't come along with any particular technology for doing that. It's still very early on in the story. These visits from overseas sailors probably aren't all that common at this point, but they're enough to give people an idea. It's like, okay, so we know you can somehow record the spoken language. Let's work out a way to do it. And they work out this kind of wonderful, mysterious, still completely unfathomable way of doing it.
Let me ask you another question, a bit, I guess, following that theme on the exchange from the east to the west, and it's about the Phoenicians, and you're probably the best person to talk about this. What's the deal with them? And again, this issue about the identity, which seems to be also something more of a conversation we are having, and it's not really what they were thinking, at least not about themselves. What's the story about the Phoenicians, and how do you see their role in this larger story of exchange in the Mediterranean?
Yeah, so I can tell you how I what my story with the Phoenicians is, which is that I was working in the early part of my career on North Africa. And I still do work as much as I can on North Africa. It's a fascinating part of the ancient world. But so one of the things that I worked on was Carthage, this Phoenician colony in the Western Mediterranean. And so that kind of led me to kind of try and work out what I thought Phoenicians were. And I would go to, conference papers, all this kind of thing. And I would say to people, what these Phoenicians you're talking about, who are they? What's that about? How do you define a Phoenician? And people would say, oh, well, yes. Of course, they don't. I mean, really, it's a Greek idea of sort of Eastern Mediterranean sailors. They didn't call themselves Phoenician. They called themselves something else. And I thought, okay, what did they call themselves? And people sort of hum and haw for a bit. And then said, well, they called themselves Canaanite. And this turns out to be a very common idea, that these Phoenicians called themselves Canaanite. And I began to notice whenever people said that, whenever they wrote it down, they always cited the same 3 or 4 ancient sources for the idea that these Phoenicians were Canaanite, called themselves, had their own identity, a kind of a group corporate identity, with a label, Canaanite. And so this mapped on to this Greek idea of a group of people called Phoenicians. And that was fine, but I wanted to kind of pin it down. So I started looking at these sources. And I realised that even though they had been kind of copied from sort of footnote to footnote to footnote in textbooks for decades, none of them really held up. You know, one was based on a kind of Carthaginian, sort of not Carthaginian, sort of actually kind of Algerian in modern terms, inscription written in sort of Phoenician language script, that basically had been misread. That the word that was supposed to be Canaanite didn't actually say that, and that probably was meant something completely different. You know, there's a kind of side in some of the writings of Saint Augustine that have been understood again to mean these people call themselves Canaanites. But when I looked into it, actually the manuscript tradition was completely corrupt. So in different ways, like a series of sort of typos or misunderstandings, like all of these actually very small collection of pieces of evidence that these people called themselves Canaanites just didn't work. And so that made me kind of think, well, what's going on here? Do we actually have any evidence that they think of themselves as a corporate group? And if not, and I think not really, we can identify certain kind of cultural similarities and so on. Obviously, there's a lot of contact between people who speak the same language. That makes a lot of kind of cultural exchange, if you like, easier. But I was sort of looking at what actually brings these people together, and the kinds of things that I identified were not what we would now call ethnic or national identities. They were things like religious practices, or particular cults of particular gods and goddesses. Family was a huge thing, kind of ideas of kin groups, all sorts of different things. There wasn't sort of one kind of answer to the question, but it was particularly interesting to me because I think it's so easy in the modern world to think that it's a bit like civilizational thinking, kind of ethnic thinking, to think that ethnicity is something that's a kind of natural fact about people. Everybody has an ethnicity. You just have to work out what it is or ask them what it is. And I think whether or not that's true in the modern world, it really isn't true about the ancient world. I mean, you can certainly trace the development of sort of corporate identities that we would call ethnicities at certain times and places. Famously, they tend to become stronger at times of war, and so on. But it's not the whole story. And there are plenty of kind of periods, places, sort of historical dynamics going on in antiquity, where identity in that sense, so identity at a sort of quite large scale, corporate identity of people you don't actually know, is just not something that's applicable to the lives of most people. And so I found that, I mean, again, the Phoenicians was a kind of case study for that. It was a particularly nice example because there was no clear evidence for a self-identification as a single ethnicity among these people who spoke this collection of dialects that we, I think, quite reasonably kind of group together as Phoenician. But then, okay, so what do they mean for this book? And I think what it really comes down to is this set of cities along the coast of the Levant. So again, we're talking Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, those sorts of cities. The people living in them, called Phoenicians by the Greeks. To them, they must all look very similar, coming from a similar part of the world, a very long way from Greece, speaking a very similar language. It's very different from Greek. But to themselves, they look very different, right? It's a completely different state, little city-states along the coast, with the people in them identifying in terms of their own cities, their own families, and so on, as far as we can tell. So again, religious, particularly religious cults they're interested in. So, these little, as very small cities were essentially the big winners from the collapse of the Bronze Age. So when the big imperial palace states of the Bronze Age, for reasons that are still somewhat unclear, though my friend and colleague Eric Klein has written wonderfully about this, and I recommend his book 1177 and the follow-up now after 1177 for this particular history. But what essentially collapses at the collapse of the Bronze Age is these enormous imperial kingdoms. And what that means is it opens up a kind of power vacuum, and these little cities in the Levant, these Phoenician and inverted commas cities, kind of really step into it. That they were just subjects of the kind of king of Egypt or the Hittite king in what's now Turkey, or Mesopotamian kings and so on. But now those kings either have gone or are no longer nearly as powerful. And so these cities can actually get real independent power of their own. And they benefit enormously as well from being on the sea and being kind of the early experts in sea sailing. And so they're really the people who stitch the Mediterranean together in the first millennium BCE, long before the Greeks or Greek speakers are beginning to kind of trade and settle around the Mediterranean. The people from these Levantine city-states are doing that, are reaching into the Atlantic by the 9th century BCE, and then kind of filling in around the sea, in the spaces in between. And so I think they're really pioneers in this kind of long distance, sustained cultural contact that I think is really important for actually making history. I mean, brief contacts, occasional visits and so on can be interesting, but to really kind of build up the sort of long-term relationships, sort of ideas about reliability and trust, you need relatively frequent, relatively predictable contact. And that's what comes from these Levantine city-states. And they're really kind of, sort of stitching the whole of the Mediterranean Sea together. And that includes not only North Africa, but also Southern Europe in that period.
Let me ask you now about probably another part of this exchange circuits. That probably it's different in the sense that both this case of the Minoans and the Phoenicians emphasize this Eastern-West interaction, right? But you take the time to argue, there's also this North-South interaction. What are the key events or peoples or processes to focus if you want to think about those interactions?
Yeah, I mean, this is really important to me in writing the book because, the idea of, some people ask me, why is your book not called How the East Made the West? That seemed a more obvious thing. I thought, I don't think that's what happened. This is a story about kind of entanglement in all directions. It's not about one way influence or sort of action of any one part of the world on any other part. And so I really did want to bring in stories that kind of involve north-south axes as well. I think another kind of aspect of that is that, again, going back to the way that a lot of my ideas come straight out of ancient Greek and Roman ideas, and the idea of kind of East versus West isn't really an operational concept in antiquity. It's not certainly not Greco-Roman antiquity. When people talk about East and West, it tends to be with an idea of connection between them, particularly the path of the sun is the thing that connects, the East and the West. Whereas if ancient geographers, ancient philosophers are trying to kind of divide the world up, one of the most obvious ways to do it is north to south. People divide it up into climate zones. And of course, that makes sense. I mean, this really makes a huge difference in terms of your life, whether you're living in California or Norway or whatever it might be, in a way that, or even say, within the same continents in California or Canada or Alaska or whatever, that's going to make a huge difference in a way that whether you're in California or Florida might not make much of a difference. So I kind of wanted to kind of practice thinking in that sort of more ancient way about the world, to kind of, to play the game of undermining modern ideas about antiquity by trying to think in the ways of antiquity. But in terms of the way it actually works, I mean, I'll just take a couple of examples of stories that I really enjoyed the researching and telling. So if we're looking at the North, to take an early example, there's a tendency to tell the story of ancient history from east to west. So you have Mesopotamians and Egyptians, maybe even ancient India. And then there's a kind of subsequently, you have Greece, and then after that you get Rome, and kind of everything sort of moving very nicely from east to west, so that eventually you end up in Western Europe. But actually what that involves is ignoring all the connections between Northern and Southern Europe, and even Northern Europe and Western Asia, Northern Europe and North Africa, back in the Middle Bronze Age. In the second millennium BCE, people are bringing amber from the far north, from what's now Scandinavia and the Baltic, through the European river system, not only to places like Crete and Greece, these Minoans and Mycenaeans kind of take advantage of it, but even getting further to Egypt, to Syria, and so on. And vice versa. This means that kind of extraordinary precious stones from Africa, from Central Asia, and so on, are reaching, in some cases, Northern Europe. In this era. And again, it's a story about metals. You've got tin in Cornwall, you've got copper in the Alps, you've got all sorts of things that now scientists can actually trace how much they're moving around. And the thing that's really exciting about that is that when it looked like this was about, a few bits of precious metal and funny bits of resin like amber traveling around, people could sort of shrug and say, oh, well, yeah, somebody just had, picked up some stuff and put it in a little bag, their shoulder bag or whatever. But you're talking about metals. You're really talking about organized, heavy-duty transport. So this is not a kind of random explorer who turns up with a knapsack full of amber somewhere in Mycenae, but really kind of organized, again, not necessarily very frequent, but reliable contacts that are going all the way across Europe and into Africa and Asia back in the second millennium BCE. So that's sort of one example of kind of north to south. And you can then see connections in ideas that are coming kind of fuzzily, as you'd expect, because it's not that I think any individuals are making those months-long journeys themselves. But things like shaving becomes very fashionable in what's now Denmark around the kind of 15th century BCE. And the kind of razors they're using look awfully like the ones that are being used in the Mediterranean at that time. So that kind of thing. And, there are all sorts of ideas, more speculative ideas about religious ideas about the gods and religion and so on that you can perhaps connect as well. But I tended to leave that kind of thing out of the book, although it fascinates me, because I wanted to make a pretty watertight case. I wanted to stick to the stuff that I could, to my own satisfaction at least, kind of prove and really demonstrate was the case. Connections that were definite, ideas that cannot have come from anywhere else. But there's a whole, which means that, unfortunately, it's a whole set of kind of mentalities that other people write about in much more detail than I do. But that's an example from the Bronze Age. If we wanted to look in the other direction, really sort of goes right to the other end of the story. The model provided by the Islamic Mediterranean for medieval Europe is extraordinary. And whether you trace that in architecture, in scholarship, in science, in the arrival of numbers, the numerals that we use now, people call them Arabic numerals, they're actually Indian. But they're brought through this extraordinary kind of intellectual tradition of the Islamic Mediterranean that sort of bursts into Europe in the 12th century. Or again, perhaps I'm getting that the wrong way around. I should put it to say that European scholars begin to access it in the 12th century. And that's, people sometimes talk about the 12th century Renaissance in Europe. And that's really this kind of, I think now we sort of talk more about the sort of 15th century, 16th century kind of Renaissance, it's very humanities, arts and so on. But in fact, I think the modern world is much more owes much more debt to what happened a few centuries earlier when kind of Islamic science essentially arrived in Europe. And so I think that's but at both ends of the story. There's plenty of other stuff in the middle, but those are kind of examples of the ways that both that things, seriously important and interesting new ideas can come from north and south as well as from east or indeed west. But also that in all these cases, it's about connections and relationships developing between people. Nobody just arrives in a new place and says, "Aha! I have new things and answers for you, my grateful people." These things develop, and the sort of the new idea is always genuinely a new one. It's not just a copy of something that's imported from outside. It's a reaction to things that are learnt from other places.
And let me finish then this conversation with a question that it's I guess it has a practical perspective, but probably it's part of that same thing, right? About how we as society absorb information and ideas flow. And what I want to ask you is about your role as I guess public intellectual, for the lack of a better word. And I think it's interesting, and I'm curious about how you experience that role, but I'm also curious about how you perceive more broadly the role of historians, ancient historians, medieval historians, as people that are saying things that we seem to be craving for, right? And you mentioned Eric Klein recently. I had him here on the podcast. I know you know Peter Frankopan.
Yeah.
He also, like, and the three of you, and I could come up like the same, like Ian Morris as well, and several others are people that are thinking about the distant past to inform us about the present. We seem to be craving for that, but at the same time, and I think, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. You also feel that in academia, history seems to be decaying. The departments are getting smaller. The attention of academia seems to be moving away from that. So how do you reconcile that? Like, how do you think about this type of stuff?
No, that's a really interesting question. I think in the personal sense, you've listed some real giants of the kind of public intellectual field there, and I'm a very, very kind of minnow in that pond. It's just an immense privilege to get to talk to people, to get to talk to people outside my own academic speciality about anything, really. I mean, academics don't get out much, so it's that's just a complete joy to me, and that's sort of how I kind of personally experience it. I always come away from these kinds of conversations with new ideas, ways of thinking about things. I think more generally, it is a striking. So I think if we were having this conversation in like the 1960s or the 1970s, it wouldn't seem so unusual for historians to have a very public to write in terms of a larger public than their own students. I think that was not that everyone was doing that. Of course, there've always been specialists and specialist work and so on. And I don't, those, that can be the same people doing that. I hope I do quite a bit of specialist work myself. But I think in the sort of mid 20th century, there was more of an idea that it was something of a responsibility even to actually communicate the way, for historians, the way that we see the world to a broader group of people than just our own students. And that kind of fell away, I think, in the later 20th century. And it's kind of come back just in the last, sort of 15, 20 years. And exactly as you say, at a time when humanities in general, history departments, in some places at least, have been struggling. I think there's a way of seeing a positive side here. I won't say of telling this as a positive story because it's never good to see academic discipline struggling. But I think perhaps this is a way in which the very narrow disciplinarity that has grown up in academia over the last, overall over about 200 years, but particularly in the last 50 to 100 years, can be challenged a little bit. I think the fact that we're having this conversation, I'm sitting here in the political science department having this conversation with you, is a really positive way of seeing that we don't have to stick within our own specialities, and that we can actually have useful conversations across subjects and across different kinds of audiences. So I suppose what I would say is that I hope that these kinds of books, these kinds of these sort of public conversations that historians are having at the moment can be part of a broader opening up of the world of knowledge, let's say the world of universities, to see a future that in a very positive way can move beyond narrow disciplinarity.
I think that's a great way of finishing this conversation. Thanks a lot, Joe, for taking the time for talking to us, but also to write this fascinating book. I really enjoyed reading it, so thanks for that.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Economic and Political History Podcast. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged, thank you, and take care.